Welcome. You're watching The Big Question. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. All eyes are on US President Donald Trump as the world braces for what he has dramatically declared as Liberation Day. That's April 2nd. He says it will be Liberation Day for the United States, a day that he claims will free the US from its reliance on foreign goods. Now, this involves a comprehensive set of reciprocal tariffs, which essentially means that the US now plans to match the duties that other countries charge on American products. Take India, for instance. India's weighted tariff rate on US imports is about 12%, as opposed to what US charges on Indian imports, which is 3%. To better explain Trump's logic, let's take the example of agricultural goods. According to a White House fact sheet, while India charges 39% tariff on agricultural goods, the US charges only 5% for the same goods. Mr. Trump blames these differential tariffs for US's trillion-dollar trade deficit with its trading partners. And when it comes to India, the trade deficit between the two nations has only widened, reaching $45.7 billion in 2024. Now, in the run-up to April 2nd, there has been a lot of speculation surrounding reciprocal tariffs, with the White House once again reiterating that tariffs will go into effect immediately. However, there is no clarity yet on how these reciprocal tariffs will be calculated. Will it be country-wise? Will it be sector-wise? Will it be item-wise? Now, Trump has already said that India will reduce its tariffs substantially. One thing is clear, though, the ramifications that reciprocal tariffs will have on India will be something that will have great impact, even if not directly, then indirectly. If tariffs slow down global growth, India will also suffer. For example, if Trump slaps India with 10% tariffs, it could cause a potential export loss of $6 billion. If tariffs are hiked to 20%, which is what is being widely reported, it will cause export losses worth $31 billion. If you look at it sector-wise, seafood, iron and steel, pharma, auto are some of the most affected sectors. Beyond the impact on India, a move of such a global scale by the world's largest economy, whose currency is the default global currency, will also have repercussions for global trade and economic stability. Major economies, including the European Union and China, have already hinted they will respond with their own tariffs, leading to a cycle of retaliation. Such developments could disrupt global supply chains, increase consumer prices, and slow economic growth worldwide. So as we prepare for the tariffs, the big question is, what will the Trump tariff war mean for India, and will India be able to weather the Trump tariff storm? To speak on this, I'm joined today by Radhika Rao, Senior Economist and Executive Director at DBS Bank, Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Anup Vadhavan, former Commerce and Trade Secretary, joins us on the show. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for your time with us here on The Big Question. Mr. Vadhavan, I'm going to begin by getting your view on how much the impact will be. One thing that is clear is that Donald Trump has been saying India is willing to reduce tariffs. Does that give a sense that for us, the outcome which we will see on April 3rd may not be that bad?
Yeah, so as far as impact is concerned, it is hard to guess. It will depend on the nature of tariffs which are put in place, the items covered, the levels at which the tariffs are imposed. So all that is very unclear. We are just guessing, from a dictionary meaning of the word reciprocal, but that is not perhaps the precise way in which they will be imposed. They'll be imposed in a manner that they are effective and they, in a sense, cause some pain to the trading partner on whom they are imposed. So let us see what gets imposed. I don't think those tariffs are going to be trade-stopping tariffs, because that will be disastrous and it will obviously invite retaliation. And the other thing to see is that we recently had a very positive visit by Mr. Brendan Leach from the USTR, and there are some signs that, the commitment to have a good faith trade negotiation for a BTA might, get this reciprocal business kept on a side in abeyance. So let us see what precisely happens, but I don't think the tariffs are going to be at a level which is going to be trade stopping and, to be more optimistic, maybe the reciprocal tariff business is put on a side for India since we are committed to a good faith trade negotiation. So let's see. It's hard to conjecture. As you mentioned, the average tariffs, there's a 9% differential between India and the US. For some sectors, the differential is much higher: textiles, agriculture, automobiles, auto components, iron and steel. The differential is more than 9%. It all depends, what understanding of reciprocal tariffs the US has and how they'll be imposed. So let's see.
Mr. Wadhwan, it's interesting that you bring about the point of the textbook definition of reciprocal. If I look at the Trump definition of how he has been describing it, he's used tariff as a verb. We will tariff them as they tariff us. So he seems pretty clear of what reciprocal means. But I want to follow up on the point that you made. India's best case scenario is that Trump doesn't talk about India at all tomorrow, or says that my deal with India is getting sorted out. Let me talk about the rest. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, I think that is a distinct possibility to my mind, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If he puts tariffs on us, then, it's a standard trade response that you sort of reciprocate, you retaliate, because after all, we also are part of the political economy, which has its own compulsions. So, I'm sure better sense might prevail, and he will not put countries like India, which are committed to a good faith negotiation, in that position. If he does that, then of course, that will be a parallel track. The reciprocal tariff business will be one track, and the trade negotiation will be a separate track. So they must understand that, and let's hope that can be avoided, and we can have a good faith negotiation with a quick timeline, which takes our trade to around $500 billion, as the two countries have decided. So let's hope that is the sensible path which we are able to adopt.
Sensible is the key word here. I think the word that we're all looking for. Radhika Rao, let's understand in real terms what the impact is from a US perspective first, and then an Indian perspective. I was having a very interesting conversation today with Mark Matthews, who says that when it comes down to it, the impact, the inflationary impact on reciprocal tariffs is not going to be as much as is expected on US consumers, because it's going to be on certain components of goods. Likewise, for an Indian perspective, in terms of exports, is the impact as harsh as it's being made out to be? What are your own calculations?
I think this is one of these announcements that have been awaited with a lot of interest, not only from India, but many of the other US trading partners as well. And to answer your question, I would think that, let's see the quantum of the trade surplus that India has vis-a-vis the US. In terms of percent of GDP, it's about 1.2% of GDP, right? So it's not that significant, but again, a number to reckon with. The other factor that you mentioned is, the net impact. I think if you see the nature of the exports, the trade that India and US has as well, is not so much, I would think, manufactured goods. Of course, off late, you have seen actually electronics equipment, even electronics, hand phone manufacturing that has been happening in India, those exports to the US increasing. But otherwise, the other components are gems and jewelry, pharma, chemicals. So something that it's more at the raw material capital goods stage rather than the consumer goods. Vis-a-vis, I would say, compare with China. Much of China's trade with the US is manufactured goods, majority of it. So that, of course, has more inflationary impact. So in terms of China, India and US trade, I would think certainly the nature of the tax agreement that they're going to read. I think I just want to reference here a report that is just out, which is basically the National Trade Estimate report by the USTR, which is the latest update. That actually cites, it's quite exhaustive. If you were to read the India section of the report, it not only just touches on tariffs, it touches on a whole lot of non-tariff barriers as well. Import licensing, import restrictions, even Make in India approach, subsidies, all of that. So in a way, if there is a reason to impose tariffs, US has prepared sufficient ground for that. But then again, as Mr. Madhavan mentioned, if they put up saying, India could be subject to 8-9% tariff, but it will be pending given that negotiations are going on, and India has been one of the most proactive countries, I would think, who has taken steps right from earlier this year. Soon after the Trump presidency came into power, Trump to go over. To hold negotiations, talk about the bilateral trade agreement, and try and bring it into fruition, at least the first phase by fall. So net, I would think the impact on India, to answer your question, overall the trade surplus is about 1.2% of GDP. So I would think 10 to 20 basis point of net impact is possible. Again, depending on the nature of the tariff that is imposed. Inflationary, not so much for India, of course, for the US much more. But even for the US, I would think the nature of India-US trade is not so much consumer goods. It's much more to the businesses, like I mentioned earlier, raw materials as well as capital goods.
So, now let's drill down to where the tariffs could actually pinch from an Indian perspective. And Mr. Krishna, I want to come to you on this. Where it's really going to hurt is if they insist on agricultural goods, isn't it? If I were to oversimplify, yes, pharma on one end, we're talking about auto components, we're talking about textiles, but where it pinches us is agriculture.
Tamanna, I mean, let's look at, the US-India trade, which is of the order of about $200 billion. I think both President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, they issued a joint statement some time back, and they talked about it going to 500 billion by the year 2030. So my feeling is nothing radical will happen in a few hours from now. It could perhaps be a 10% tariff, which is an impact which India could cope with and could recover through other opportunities. But more than that will be difficult. And coming back to your question on agriculture, I think we will come to the tariff issues on agriculture later, but let's look at the non-tariff areas which the USTR report has talked about. They've talked about, the India gives agro subsidies, free energy, electricity, crop insurance is available free of cost to farmers. Fertilizer subsidies are there, seed subsidies are there. So they're talking about that being unfair. So while from their perspective, they may see it as being unfair, but let's look at our economy, political economy. Farmers, large number of Indian farmers are poor and marginal farmers. If these benefits are not given to them, they would have problem of sustenance. So I think these are the kind of issues which India can't, the non-tariff issues which India can't really address much, because the way our polity of the country is shaped. But more on the tariff side, some of the things which have been hurting the US, and they've been talking about it, tom-tomming about it quite a lot, is about apples, which has 50% duty in India, import duty. Corn, which has 50%, coffee, which has 100%, raisins, walnuts, almonds, which has 100%, whiskey, which has about 150%, flowers has 60%. So I think these are the kind of things, French fries, drug formulations, potatoes, canned peaches. I think these are the areas which they have talked about. And some change India could affect in that, but not very radical for sure, because it will.
I'm actually going to come to you on that list, and because it's a very good illustration of what we can and what we cannot do. Now, some would argue, all right, let's drop the tariffs on whiskey. What is going to be the consumption and impact on domestic industry? But when it comes to corn, do we want to open the floodgates to American corn? When it comes to coffee, we are now in a sort of renaissance of what's happening with Indian coffee. Do we want to open the floodgates there? Do you think that kind of nuance is something that right now diplomats from the Indian side are sitting and looking at very, very closely?
So I think, Rajesh Agrawal, the Additional Secretary in Ministry of Commerce, and Brendan Lynch, the Assistant USTR, which who've been talking for last 4 or 5 days. I think these issues, I'm sure, have come up. See, at the end of the day, you have to regulate a tariff, you have to protect your domestic industry, you have to generate revenue from import duty. So I think these compulsions remain. And some tweaking here and there is possible. I think India auto and farm sector. These are the two product categories where India has huge amount of concerns, because let's understand, manufacturing is still a small percentage of Indian GDP, and in manufacturing, auto constitutes, if I'm not mistaken, almost 40% come from auto and auto ancillary units themselves. So I think that's something which India can't given that that easily. Although India has indicated, I mean, nothing has come out officially from the government, but some indications are that on information and communication technology equipment, metals, mobiles, I think India has shown willingness to reduce, the import duty. But I think many other agro commodities, because it will hurt the farmers, there may be some minor adjustments, but a huge amount of change may not happen. See, not just it's a US and India tariff issue, Tamanna. If you look at with EU, with China, Canada, Mexico, whatever has happened, I even see it as some kind of an opportunity, not across the board, but for some specific product categories, where we are not as competitive today to export to the US. I think with the barriers, both tariff and non-tariff, which will emerge with these other countries or group of countries, I'm sure some floodgates of opportunity would open for India as well.
Okay, and one sec. That's an important point. I don't want Mr. Vadhavan to come into it. What is this floodgate of opportunity? Because we've been looking and talking about this floodgate of opportunity post-COVID, when we went into China +1, in the last Trump administration as well. Does that floodgate of opportunity still exist? And if yes, what does it look like in your view?
So certainly, there's an opportunity as part of the bilateral trade agreement. There's an opportunity to, grow trade, and these negotiations happen on a very systematic, technical basis. Each side has what in trade parlance is called certain ambitions or certain wants from the other country, and then each side has certain sensitivities. So the Americans will convey to us what they want from us. We'll examine that list. We'll identify things we can do easily. We'll identify things which we are sensitive on. And then typically, in trade parlance, there are various sort of safeguards you can put in place to protect your sensitivities. One safeguard is, staging of duty. So your duty does not come down to zero. It comes to a moderate level, or it comes down slowly over a number of years. Then you have instruments like a tariff rate quota, where the quantities are restricted. Let us say you open up to American agricultural products or dairy products, you limit the quantity so that there is no, surge of imports into India. So all these mechanisms are there. So ultimately, you balance your ambition and sensitivities in this manner and come out with a trade agreement that is mutually, beneficial and to the satisfaction of both sides. I'm sure that will happen. The other aspect of, floodgate of opportunity is that indiscriminate, tariff barriers going on year after year, decade after decade is not a recommended, economic or trade policy. So it's an opportunity for us to rationalize our tariffs. Certainly, tariffs are very important instruments of protecting your domestic interests, protecting your, security and strategic interests. But they have to be used carefully and selectively. You can't have high tariff walls. So it's an opportunity to rationalize our tariff.
So it's like this. Whenever there is, any kind of adversity, you try to look at the best possible outcome. Okay, maybe this is a learning moment. I know I'm making a very simplistic parallel, but it is in a sense like that. If we are being forced to lower tariffs, then it's a learning moment. It's an opportunity for domestic industry to strengthen up. But you would ideally want to do that at your own time and on your own clock, not under the gun with someone else pulling the trigger. So now, then my question is, if that trigger is pulled tomorrow and we don't know what the outcome is, Radhika Rao, what are the sectors that are going to be hurt the most from an Indian perspective?
Actually, I want to also drop on that bit that you mentioned about agricultural products and non-agricultural products. In fact, if you see the nature of trade, it's quite non-agricultural product heavy. And where the tariffs are lower than the agricultural products. So the tariff rate, if you just take it at the tariff rate level, of course, the non-agricultural is 1/3 of agricultural in terms of just the tariff rate. But if you see the volume or the value of trade that we have with the US, it is more non-agricultural heavy. So to that sense, I would think that if India and the authorities are able to showcase that we would meet you halfway through, we will make some concessions, but not swing completely the other way. I think again there is some we can consider that a meeting of minds at least. And I completely agree that if the political economy for the agriculture sector is very crucial. Coming to your question on where there will be the impact will be most, I think that will really depend on the kind of taxes, reciprocal taxes, or at least a threat thereof is imposed. Is it on sectors where the gap is the highest between where US is and where India is? If that's the case, then you would see automobiles, textiles, iron and steel, agricultural products. That would be where the impact would be the most. If we say which are the economically important sectors for India in terms of trade, then it will be pharma, chemicals, electronics, gems and jewelry. So in that order. So it really depends on what kind of tax is imposed and whether it's economically important to mean that the value of exports that India does is that big enough to show some amount of impact. So I think overall these would be the sectors that would very much be in show. Again, agricultural is something that if India needs to bridge that gap because now India enjoys a trade surplus, but it wants to make it a bit more balanced. Where can they step up? I think they've already spoken about energy, already spoken about defense equipment. Agriculture is another aspect. And again, I'll bring China in here because if you remember 2019, President Trump's first term, at that time, there was this attempt to better balance the trade between the two countries. And a lot of the discussion was around soybeans and how China could step up those purchases. So again, I think something will get visited for India as well. So overall, I would think this would be my sector breakup of which is still quite non-agricultural heavy, at least in terms of the sectors that are important or have sufficient share in overall export.
I want to ask a broader question here, and Mr. Krishna, I'm going to come to you on this. At the end of all of it, what is the purpose? Which is why this has been dubbed as Liberation Day, right? From a Trump political perspective and for the US domestic audience. Do you think that the path to liberation for the United States is paved with these tariffs? Because the idea is we make imports more expensive, we start making more here. Or you incentivize global companies to come and invest and make in the US.
Yeah, so I hope, the Liberalization Day doesn't become a martyrdom day for Indian exports to the US. I think, look at last few months, India has already shown some way forward. The equalization levy, which is the Google tax of 6% has been removed. If you look at India has shown that, if there is a trade deficit in the favor of, in India's favor, we could address it through some newer products like oil and energy. Of course, logistics and our place on the geographical map doesn't make it that seamless and easy. But yeah, they are in today's day and age, it is possible. So I think these are some of the areas which India has opened, and India has its own, wish list also. Some of the most important things that come to my mind are, US has a very strict pharma export stipulations, pharma exports from India to the US. I think they have very strict stipulations, so for which a lot of our pharma companies find entry barriers there. So I think these kind of things are there, but eventually I somehow feel if the bilateral trade agreement has to see the light of the day by September 2025. I think US should behave responsibly by not introducing a reciprocal tax, but at best have a 10% levy and then pave way, because if you have a very, very stringent tariff imposed, then there'll be no elbow space to discuss a bilateral trade agreement or probably a FTA in future. So I think at the end of the day, I've always been saying that, countries in today's day and age don't necessarily get what they deserve. They get what they negotiate. And, India, from whatever insights I have, of course, government has not come out, sharing much about it. But I'm sure things will not be as adverse as they're being talked about. Because at the end of the day, US should also think, how many countries in the world they can afford to antagonize. They've done it with China, they're doing it with Mexico, with Canada, with the European Union. And if the same, India is also treated in the same breath, I think then it won't speak. I think US also has something to lose in that battle, not just India. I think. I hope the wise sense prevails and space is kept vacant and open for negotiations on BTA or a possible FTA in next few months' time.
The interesting thing is that a lot of nations right now are hoping for the same. From their own perspective. My question to you, Mr. Vadhavan, is a slightly tricky one before we close the show, is do you think that we'll see some sort of announcement from the Indian side in a preemptive fashion so that when President Trump in a few hours from now wants to talk about tariffs, he can say that, well, we have another conversation going on with India and they're not part of this broad brush of announcements. Would that be something that makes sense?
I think whatever preemptive messages have to be shared have already been shared over the last few days with the US side. So I don't foresee any other preemptive signal before President Trump goes ahead and announces his tariffs. So I don't think there is now space for that or an opportunity for that. Whatever had to be conveyed through gestures and otherwise has already been conveyed. And that you're talking about Liberation Day, I don't think this Liberation Day will amount to any economic benefits for the US in the short or the long term. The US economy is at full employment. They've graduated away from manufacturing to higher value addition areas, technology, e-commerce, services. So it's a misleading proposition that the world has taken advantage of the US just because the US has a goods trade deficit because they've graduated away to non-manufacturing areas. So this is, and they are not going to be sustainable, these tariffs, because sooner rather than later you will realize that you're actually undermining US interests. It will just attract attention of the world towards services, towards tech, towards e-commerce, and then the world will, factor those in when they respond to US tariffs. So I don't think this, unfounded series of steps is going to be sustainable for too long. Very soon it will be realized that there is no liberation possible, with these methods. And already, with Canada, Mexico, they've taken the FTA goods out of the calculus. Markets are down already. If some catastrophic, all inclusive across the globe kind of action happens by way of these reciprocal actions, you will see the results on the market very, very quickly.
Yep.
And I don't think they'll be sustainable.
Yep.
So let's see. It's quite interesting.
It shouldn't be a liberation from economic growth. If for nothing else, I don't think that's what anyone wants. But having said
that, one other thing we forget is the world will carve itself around the US rest of the world relationship. The US has high tariffs for rest of the world has high tariffs for US, and the rest of the world has low tariffs for each other.
Correct.
So obviously economic activity will shift out of the US rest of the world relationship
perfectly makes perfect sense. You don't want, the US will not want to be isolated in that sense. But well, a lot to follow through, and we'll be tracking the story very, very closely. Thank you, meanwhile, for speaking with us. Excellent conversation with Jayant Krishna, Radhika Rao, and of course Anup Vadhavan on what could be expected and can India weather the storm. Watch this space. We will be looking at all of the developments as they unfold.